Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Alison Baverstock. Alison is the Professor of Publishing at Kingston University and founder of Reading Force, a military charity that uses books to bring together children and families from the forces. Last year, Alison received an MBE in recognition of her services to military families. Today, Alison will explore the status and perspectives of military wives and partners from the Army's early history to the present day. So there will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For our online audience, you can post a question in the chat bar and these will be put to Alison at the end. In person, just raise your hand and I'll come around with a microphone. Moving on with some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all said, I will now pass over to Alison, and I hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed for coming. When the tube strike was announced, I did rather wonder whether I'd be talking to myself. So it's lovely to see so many of you. Could I just ask for a show of hands? How many here are either current or former services partners? Oh, so quite a few. Jolly good. So I put up the picture of Boudica, as I think it's pronounced. It struck me that she perhaps was one of the first military partners, because after the death of her husband, Prasutagus, I think that's how you say it, she took over. And it struck me that that was quite a good model. I'm going to, when I was doing the research for this talk, and I'll talk about what I'm going to cover in just a moment, I came across, has anybody seen here The Recruiting Officer by George Farquhar? So it was a play, he wrote it the year before he died. He died in 1707. And I thought this quotation, it really jumped out at me because I think it sums up the sort of dichotomy of the situation of military wives, or military partners, I should call them. I hope you have more honour than to quit the service, and I hope she more prudence than to follow the camp. And that's said by a father talking to a potential suitor who's in the military about his daughter. And I think that, as I say, that dichotomy is quite well reflected in the things I'm going to share with you. My plan is I'm just going to talk about why I feel qualified to talk to you today, to look at the role of the military partner in history. But then I'd really like to look at more recent trends and bring the research I've been doing lately into the role of the military partner, which I think is really significant at the moment. So that's what I plan to do, and then to leave time for questions. So to start off with my own qualifications for speaking, I've been a military partner for 41 years. I met my husband at university, and he retired just over 10 years ago, so I'm now married to a veteran. I'm an academic and I'm a researcher, so I'm, as Amy mentioned, I'm the Professor of Publishing at Kingston University, so I hopefully bring an objectivity and my own research to that. I started the charity Reading Force 15 years ago, and the basis behind that is, as Amy explained, we connect military families through shared reading, because when your partner's in a war zone and you're at home looking after the children, it can be really difficult to find things to talk about. There's not much common ground, and that's the area we inhabit. And because we're dealing with the military all the time, but not part of the chain of command, I think we get a really realistic look at what life is like for military families these days. So that's me. I'm talking about something I've lived. This has been my life. Just to give you a case in point, my husband had 18 different jobs during his time in the army, and that most of them did involve a move. And I've lived in 16 houses. We have 4 children, and I never had the scan and the baby in the same hospital. We'd always moved mid-pregnancy, and given that a pregnancy only lasts 9 months, that's quite a short period of time. So I really am talking about something I know about. Okay. I'm starting with a picture that's actually in the National Army Museum. It's this beautiful image that's on the flyer for today. It was painted in 1795 by Henry Singleton. And at that time, it was very common for pictures to be turned into prints, which would then be sold for display in people's houses. And the fact that this picture was created in order to be turned into prints, or it was painted and then they often were turned into prints, a bit like the Bubbles, the Pears advertisement and other things. They became prints that were used in popular sales. It's interesting that this is considered a subject for general interest. The soldier has no identifying regimental marks. So although he's a light dragoon, there are no regimental marks. So actually any soldier from that sort of background could relate it to a unit that they were part of. And it's a romantic image of the distraught wife leaving her husband as he's presumably going off to battle. And there's a sense of momentum with the person holding the horse back. He's ready to go. And this image of the romance of being with a soldier or somebody in the services is, I think, continued. This painting comes from 1795, so it's painted about 50 years after the Battle of Waterloo, but it concerns the famous Duchess of Richmond's ball on the eve of Waterloo, when virtually every army officer who was going to take part in the battle, apart from the generals and Wellington, they didn't attend, was actually up till the wee small hours dancing, which is quite an interesting thing. And this again is a popular image painted 55 years later, and we can see it's a very good reflection of fashion of the time, the beautiful detail on the dress of the woman who's facing into the party. So people were fascinated by the whole concept of the military and their partners. This, however, I think is probably a more realistic image of what life was like for most of the rank and file. So we see, this is an ink drawing coloured in from 1805, and this is taken just before the Peninsular War, which was 1808 to 1814. And we see families marching along, mixed in with their servicemen husbands, and we can see women carrying babies, in some cases men carrying the babies, and the men aren't marching separately. So this is a contemporary drawing of the army on the move. And the women are raising their skirts to cross the river, which I think, I'm going to touch on this about the skill set that I think you develop as a military partner, which is resilience, ability to cope, determination. So that's, I think, a very interesting image. So I wanted to summarise the various roles that military partners have played in the army and in the services as a whole, as recruiters, as collaborators, as combatants, as negotiators, as supervisors of provisions, as cooks and as medical support, and as hairdressers. And I can give you an example of each of these. The picture that I've put there, do people recognise who that is? It's Sean Bean, but the series that it was part of, Sharp. Yeah, Sharp, I think, is particularly effective because the dramatisation of it and the books actually do feature the role of women in the camp. When you see, if you revisit it, you'll see women moving around the camp, whereas I think previously when battles were televised, you didn't tend to see the women in the camp, but they were absolutely there. You couldn't have functioned without them. Okay, so starting with the business of recruiting, Henrietta Maria was married to Charles I and has suffered, I think, from a very bad historical reputation, that she arrived with a huge retinue of Oratorian priests and loads of clothes and pages, and she never spoke English when she arrived. And she was Catholic, so she wasn't crowned because she wasn't a Protestant. And she has this terrible image of being a sort of spendthrift, but she was really effective in recruiting for the Civil War. A lot of the history that we draw on is often the observations of ambassadors, that's a very topical subject, isn't it? ambassadors who were visiting would in their letters back to whoever was sending them, would outline what was going on at the court that they were part of. And Henrietta Maria was remarkably effective in recruiting noblemen and also others to be part of the Crown's forces. And this is the Venetian ambassador who observed, without the Queen's encouragement and aid, the king would never have put himself in a position to resist. And I think that fits the wider reading I've done about Charles I, that he was a quiet man who didn't... I personally, I've always thought he might have been autistic. He wasn't very good with eye contact, and he didn't like talking to people very much. But she was remarkably effective in recruiting. There's also a very notable tradition of military wives as combatants who actually took part in the fighting. And this is again, it's an interesting picture because it's a romanticization of what happened. This woman is known as Trooper Jane, who fought during the Civil War in support of her husband, William Ingleby. And she apparently put on a suit of armour and fought in the battle. This is a Victorian rendition of her story. Apparently she kept guard over Cromwell, who was entering her castle in order to look for her husband. And I can't imagine that she was wearing what she's shown wearing here while she held him at gunpoint overnight. But this is a romantic version of the story, which again shows interest in military partners. It's also interesting to reflect on songs of the period, which feature gallant she-soldiers and women taking over the roles of their husbands when they were killed in battle. And this is, I don't know what the tune is to this one, the gallant she-soldier, but with a musket on her shoulder, her part she acted then, and everyone supposed that she had been a man. So there's a well-established tradition of women actually doing the fighting, accompanying their husbands, fighting alongside them, a bit like Jane Ingleby, as I've just shown you. And then, mindful that we've got the Royal Hospital just next door to us here, there's also Christian Davis, who was known as Kit Kavanagh, who was the first female Chelsea pensioner. It was, I think it must be about 20 years ago that there was another first pensioner, but I think they were rather forgetting about the first one. She came to note because Daniel Defoe of Gulliver's Travels fame wrote her up, but she was, and he turned her story into the life and adventures of Mrs. Christian Davis, but she was better known as Kit Kavanagh, who fought in her own right. And there are others. In fact, part of the story of Charles I, just to go back to that, there were complaints at the time about, so there were so many women serving that at one point Charles had to issue an edict against their participation. So these people weren't one-offs. And here's the gravestone of Phoebe Hessel, who again was another partner who was actively engaged in combat, and she's buried in Brighton Cemetery, St Nicholas Church, Brighton. Died in 1821, which is about the time that Persuasion was published. That was published in 1819, which is I think it's the only one of Jane Austen's novels that mentions a combatant, because, what's his name? The partner that Anne eventually marries is Wentworth. Captain Wentworth is a naval officer. Why could the women get away without being noticed? Well, I was trying to find a picture of the armour that they wore, or the clothes that they wore. And this was conventional clothing of Baron Hopton, who was one of Charles I's generals, who commanded the last royalist army. And this is a book that he wrote, and it shows the kind of clothing which would hide gender. You could wear that sort of thing and not necessarily be identified as a woman. And why did they fight? Well, it was largely to enable them to carry on drawing a pension, because given that women weren't officially there, that if the husband died, there was no money to keep them going. So they carried on fighting and drew the pay that was earned. So, and interestingly, I don't know if any of the military wives here ever got the chance to go on an exercise. the units would quite regularly put on a wives' training day on a Saturday. I did it when we lived in Germany, and we were encouraged to wear our husband's clothing to do that. So I've done that too. So moving on, wives and partners were also negotiators and influencers. This is a picture of Emma Hamilton, who she didn't ever marry Nelson, but she was as good as, and in fact Nelson requested a pension for her after he died, should he die, and the instructions were entirely ignored. She died in penury in France, but she was really charming. She went out to stay with the ambassador to the court of Naples, and it was there that she met Nelson, and she was negotiating to provision the navy, who were posted. They were at anchor off Naples, and she built a really good relationship with the King of Naples and persuaded him to provision the fleet. Which, if you don't have food, you can't take part in battles. So played a very important part. And she was also a spy. She was finding out she built a relationship with the wife with the Queen of Naples, and was finding out what was going on and feeding that information back to Nelson. So she was remarkably useful. They also, wives and partners, acted as provisioners. This is a picture from a production of Gilbert and Sullivan. Are you all familiar with Pinafore, HMS Pinafore? And in Pinafore, it's Buttercup who is provisioning the sailors who are on board. And the captain, the plot is basically the captain's daughter who lives on board with her father. And Buttercup plays a significant role in provisioning both essentials to supplement the diet and pretty young laces to brighten the faces of pretty young sweethearts and wives. So women played a role in provisioning the forces. They also played a role as cooks and laundresses. This is Mrs. Rogers, who was the wife of a non-commissioned officer at the camp of the 4th Dragoon Guards during the Crimean War. And she acted as a cook and a laundress for the regiment, and was very much admired for her bravery, because wherever the soldiers went, she went too. And there's a letter dated from 1855 when Colonel Edward Cooper Hodge, who was the commanding officer, described Mrs. Rogers as deserving the Crimean Medal 10 times more than half the men who will have got it. And it's just a gorgeous photograph, isn't it, of her in her, I don't know how she kept that clean, her long dress and her pinafore, and there she is looking after the soldiers. Back to singing as evidence, partners and wives as medical support. I don't know if you remember the sweet Polly Oliver lay musing in bed. A comical fancy came into her head, and she decides to go off and follow her true love, who's a soldier, and she dresses in her dead brother's clothes in order to disguise herself, and then nurses the soldier who's been injured back to life, and he eventually obligingly marries her after she's demonstrated her efficacy at first aid. But that was it's a very well-known folk song, and it was turned into, edited and presented by Benjamin Britten, whose picture is there. And just to read the final verse, then Polly Oliver, she burst into tears and told the good doctor her hopes and her fears. And very shortly afterwards, for better or worse, the captain took joyfully his pretty soldier nurse. So it ends well. Wives also acted as hairdressers. Living conditions in camp were difficult, and the wives, the headdresses or the hair arrangements worn by the men were extremely complicated, and they reflected rank. So there were certain complications that you had in your plaited hair, which was worn long, which needed to reflect your rank. And Richard Holmes, the historian, unfortunately he didn't give a date, but he reports about a near mutiny when the role of hairdressing was given to male barbers and hairdressers. And here we see a male barber holding a pair of what looked like shears, and women watching. But in fact, the women went back to doing the plaiting because it was quite complicated and their services were needed. However, no provision was made for these women that billeting, or for the men actually, billeting was on local families or accommodation in tents. And then more recently, wives and partners have often found employment as teachers. A teaching qualification or a nursing qualification are both very useful assets if you marry somebody in the military, and in particular teaching, because there's obviously roles within military schools. This is something I found doing some research on Facebook, that people were reminiscing about Derby School in Osnabrück, which is where I used to go in and help with reading when we lived in Osnabrück. Okay, so I wanted to move on now, having given you examples of how military wives were deployed, and to talk about recruitment within the British military and how that impacted wives. So I think the first point I just want to make is that professional recruitment into the UK military came relatively late. And in fact, many of the most decisive battles, my husband and I were watching, there's a series on at the moment about 1066 and about the Norman Conquest. Has anybody been watching this? Really well done, I think. But actually, the numbers that were taking part in these battles were quite small. So considering the significance we give to 1066, it was probably, William of Normandy assembled a force of about 4,000 people. Harold's army numbered about 7,000. So that's probably about just over 10,000 people. And that's a battle that's often seen as the sort of start of modern history. So the numbers taking part were actually relatively small. Often the battles were fought in out-of-the-way places, and then decisions were reported back to the local administration, and the system changed and everybody moved on. And again, referring to singing, some of you may know the Vicar of Bray, sir, where actually the vicar, that's to do with religion, but people adapted according to who was in charge. But the numbers actually fighting these battles was relatively low. A standing army was first established in 1660, and at first, marriage of the soldiers was very much disapproved of, but then they decided they couldn't manage without female support. And so a small percentage, it was only 6%, so 6 out of every 100 men were allowed to travel with the regiments overseas, and it was decided who could go by drawing lots or dice, and they were known as the to-goes or the not-to-goes. In 1774, Sir John Pringle referred to wives and children as an impediment and lamented the fact that them being there meant there were fewer rations for the men. In 1800, there was a special act passed allowing married soldiers to stay in quarters with their wives, and that's the term quarters, which still gets used. But there was very little housing provision. It was usually tents or billeting people with local people. And it wasn't until the later part of the 19th century when family were given sort of more lasting quarters, and some of that stock is still being used. Wives were transported around according to rank, and there is a title, the Marshal of the Hawes, that was somebody who was looking after the lower ranks partners. And they were subjected to the same discipline routine as the men. Wives were part of the unit. They were punished for poor treatment. And if their husbands treated them badly, they faced a possibility of being drummed out of the regiment. And drummed out is still a term that's used, but what as in attracting opprobrium. But at the time, drumming out had a very specific meaning, which was being put in this whirligig and moved round faster and faster until presumably you collapsed, or being put on this sort of looks a bit like a Trojan horse, doesn't it? Sat on that and beaten, so that there were provisions for not looking after your partner appropriately. It was a hard life. So I think there were changes that came to military wives and partners when there were possibilities for females to be formally involved within the military. And as support and then as combatants. So I just want to talk you through the main changes that happened as a result. The suffragettes were very much encouraging women to take up a role in support of the military. So being assistants, being drivers, being advocates. So that was quite an interesting sort of PR strike in favour of women getting involved. Then there was the foundation of the first aid nursing yeomanry, which still exists. Princess Anne is the patron of them. The Princess Royal's Volunteer Corps, which was an independent, all-female registered charity. And it was structured to look like a military reserve, but it provided relief to civil and military authorities in an emergency. And it was developed then. And then the Volunteer Corps, that was set up in 1909. So these were roles that could be allocated to wives and to women, initially as nurses, drivers, mechanics, and in communications, that sort of thing. And the Volunteer Aid Detachment provided medical assistance during time of war. Women weren't able to join formally, but that started at the beginning of the 20th century. The Navy was the first to allow women to join in their own right, with the WRNS, later called WRENS. The Army followed a year later with the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, and then the Air Force obviously was founded a little bit later, and then they allowed women to join in 1918 as part of the Women's Royal Air Force. But it's not widely known that over 100,000 women served in uniformed services in the First World War, and half were connected with nursing. And in the Second World War, there was actually conscription of women. Again, I think this isn't terribly widely known. They first called up single women and those without children, in the age bracket of 19 to 30, and later, as they needed more recruits, they allowed people aged 43 or 50 to join. So there was much wider involvement than was previously possible. And then there was, for a long time, discussion about whether women should be allowed to have frontline roles. It was often seen as a disadvantage because having women in the front line in combat positions, that women were perhaps weaker in their upper body, or that their empathy, which was acknowledged, would mean that they couldn't be as effective in battle as the men. Perhaps they lacked willingness to take risks. I'm not quoting my opinion, I'm quoting the reasons I've seen quoted. And secondly, it was also seen as a distraction, that having women on the front line would distract men from actually fulfilling their role, that they might be keener to protect the women who are fighting alongside them. But in fact, since 2018, which is relatively recent, women have been allowed on the front line. There was, the first RAF Tornado pilot, so fast jets pilot, was around the same time. And that's led to a new category, which is dual serving couples, where both partners are serving in the forces, and they usually meet at Sandhurst, and then it's a tricky thing trying to amalgamate two careers at the same time. Need to credit Army and You magazine for that rather lovely photograph. Okay, so that's how things have moved on. Now, I wanted to now share with you the research I've been doing into the role of the army wife or the military partner today, because I think it's really significant, and I think it has a huge impact on the forces that we have in this country moving forward. So the first issue to say, I'm just going to have a quick sip of water, is that the military currently has a big problem with retention. It has a problem with recruitment, but a bigger one with retention. This picture I'm showing you comes from a thing called the Haythornthwaite report, which came out in 2003. And it just gives you a snapshot of the figures. There are lots of people leaving, which is a problem, given that there's a lot of discussion about boots on the ground being deployed in various areas of our very uncertain world. So we've got a big problem with retention. And I think one of the, this is being discussed largely through how to make it better, largely through the issue of remuneration of services and also of housing. And I think there's a view that I've heard expressed that actually they need to be paid better and they need better accommodation. And I think both are true, but I do think there's a third factor which is impacting significantly on retention, which is the one I've been looking into and wanted to share with you. And that is the impact of the partner on the decision to leave. And I'd like you to hold the information I've just been giving you about the role of the spouse and how things have developed since. So I'm just going to start with a quotation, which can everybody read that, or do you want me to read it out to you? So this is something that I hear more and more in my contact with military families, that they want to work, they want to feel useful. And I think there are a number of things that confirm that situation. So the first is, again, that's very recent, by the way. It was only gained as part of my research this year from somebody whose husband has only recently left the forces. So in terms of going back to the Haythornthwaite review, which is a really significant piece of work looking at retention within the forces, they asked them about the reasons for leaving. And 59%, this is a questionnaire, a piece of research that was done on those who've left the military, so all three, it's tri-service. And 59% quoted impact on family and personal life. So that's a really significant finding. It's the number one, and it's the number two is opportunities available outside the service, which is 52%. These are big figures, and current job satisfaction levels goes down to 39%. So that's one piece of evidence. And the second is there's a thing conducted every few years called the Family Continuous Attitude Survey. And this is the most recent one, which is from 2024. And you'll see here that the number one reason spouses were asked for their causes of dissatisfaction. And the number one, 57%, is actually effect on my career. And that, I think, is really significant. And it actually beats amount of separation from my spouse, which is the second number, which is 54%. So to me, that's pretty significant that spouses are feeling it's damaging to their own career. I wanted to show you this advertisement jumped out at me. I chose it really because it's the first car I can remember my father and my parents having, a Morris Oxford, and even the colours are the same, actually. But I thought it was quite significant because it dates from the 1960s. And it's interesting because although the advert, I mean, we would now consider this either quaint or grossly sexist, but the quote is, while his thoughts are under the bonnet, she's got her feet on the ground, and together you'll choose Morris Oxford. But I thought it was quite significant in that it's presenting the perspective of both partners, the male and the female. And I thought that was interesting. If we look at, again, this is quoting the Haythornthwaite report, that the median length of service now this is tied to periods of time that you sign up for, but it does reflect people choosing not to sign on for longer after their period of service that they've initially committed for is expired. But the average length of time in the service is about 10 years, slightly more in the RAF. And if I relate that to the life I have lived, to me that's joining as a single person, meeting somebody, getting married, having a couple of children, and then the children reach, 5 or 6, and you think, actually, do I want to continue with this life? Do I want to carry on moving house all the time? And that seems to me quite an interesting piece of evidence about the impact of partners. I think there are various issues that are facing forces families, or do face them. There's a lot of separation. There's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, at the moment, I think there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty about what will be required of the forces. There can be communication difficulties about how to keep partners involved when you're actually living in different places. A lot of moving house, a lot of integration difficulties, disrupted education, and difficulties of keeping friendships going. And overall, resilience is needed. Separation from the wider family. This can be difficult because in the UK now, the biggest source of childcare is actually grandparents. There are more grandparents looking after children than there are, I don't know if any of you have escaped from that for today, but there are more grandparents looking after children than there are nannies or nurseries. And this is an option that is routinely not available to military children because they're very seldom living near their grandparents. And then there are lots of local services that are difficult to secure, like membership of the Brownies or the Cubs, or finding a dentist is an ongoing challenge. And the career of the partner suffers. And although the military covenant was set up in order to make life, not to give military families an advantage, but to make life more equal, there are repeated responses from military families that it doesn't actually make any difference. And the government is now proposing to enshrine, they're actively going to enshrine this in law, that local authorities have to give parity of treatment to military families. That's a picture of our eldest son, actually, the day he started school. And just as an example of the sort of instability I'm talking about, that he was due to start school in the January, and we didn't know where we were being posted to until the 18th of December, by which time the school had closed. And we had to liaise with the school after the closing date. And we managed to get a uniform in time, but it is, I think, indicative of the kind of challenging role of the partner. And it is generally the partner that sorts this out, because I know from personal experience, my husband always seemed to be away on training courses whenever we were moving house, that training courses for the next, I see several of you nodding, training courses for the next job. So I think as a result, the military partner develops a skill set. This is actually remarkable. So they have to demonstrate flexibility. They have to demonstrate the ability to manage change. They have to be resilient. They have to keep going. They have to be diplomatic, because quite often they're negotiating with people at different seniority levels, which can be problematic when it comes to trying to achieve things for your family. So, for example, negotiating with schools to take our children. If I'd gone in and said, well, actually, the military covenant allows you to take our children, I don't think it would have been a very effective strategy. Whereas if you go in and say, well, I wonder, I've heard about the military covenant. Does that enable you to do anything for us? So that requires diplomacy, doesn't it? It requires you to alter the message according to who you're talking to. It also requires independent thinking, and it requires creativity. And these are all really useful skills. And I think the interesting thing is that these fit what's known as the workforce of the future. Have any of you heard that term, the workforce of the future? Because it's actually a thing within universities. It's being actively studied within universities, what kind of workforce we need in future. And my own background at Kingston University, there's been a lot of work done on this because universities now get funding from central government according to the employability of their students. So they survey us to find out how many students have got jobs that are counted as graduate jobs at a certain level and a certain salary. And actually, there's a really remarkable overlap between what the workforce of the future is demanding and the skill set of military partners. In particular, the ability to manage change. There's been a lot of research done into that, about how today's children are kept indoors in order to keep them safe, as opposed to being able to be out on their bikes. You see that sort of reflection quite a lot. And I know from my own experience living where I do, people often move to this area. I live in Kingston on Thames. People often move there because the schools are very good. They move there before their child starts school. The child doesn't move again until they go off to university. And that means they've never had to confront change, to confront a problem. And the first time that happens can be when they go on to university, when they have to survive on their own. And this sort of rich skill set that military partners have developed over the years, I think is summed up very effectively by this head teacher in Camberley, who I met as part of my research. We have found that the rich life experience and coping strategies developed by military partners, not to mention their can-do, hands-on attitudes, to be immense assets. They're never fazed by the unexpected and are ongoingly rigorous and effective in their project management. And that's Jo Luman, who's a head teacher, not from a military background, but she has in fact recruited office staff consciously from military partners because she finds them so effective in dealing with everyday crises. Okay, so I wanted to also outline other societal trends that I think are impacting on patterns of recruitment and retention within the armed forces, all of which I think influence partners and wives. I keep saying partners and wives, but in general, within the military, it was wives, not partners. It was mostly women, and there were restrictions about you had to be married in order to be entitled to a quota. So, although it's not very politically correct to just say wives, it was mostly wives I've been talking to. So, societal trends that have impacted partners, and I want to talk about all of these briefly. So, professional recruitment, the recruit of graduates into the armed forces, I think, has had a big impact, and the other factors like employability and work experience. So, starting with recruitment into the UK armed forces, this is a fairly standard. You can find a website actually that includes all the military advertising, which is wonderful. If anybody has a spare half an hour, you'd really enjoy looking through it all. And this is rather typical of the sort of gung-ho attitude of a lot of the advertising. But I think one of the most significant things is the decision of the military to start consciously recruiting graduates. I think that had a big impact on relationships within the military. This started in, the Cardwell Army reforms firstly meant that you could no longer buy a commission. You used to be able to buy a commission in the military. And in 1970, it was decided to amalgamate officer training. And they built this, which is Victory College at Sandhurst. And that was where the graduates were put. They were kept separate from the rest of the people going through the basic training. And graduates tend to have married graduates. And I think this has had a really significant impact on the kind of people who become Army and services officers, and then also those who decide subsequently to leave. Because I think graduates tend to arrive with their own set of loyalties, which are parallel. They're linking to other people who are on the same course as them, who've been through the same educational background. And I think that has had a big impact. It was also reinforced in my experience at Staff College, where, again, you were with your own cohort. Most people had met at university, and that impacted quite significantly on the atmosphere within the wives. I think there's also a significant thing that employability began to be taught in schools, along with work experience. Now, this is quite interesting when you look at the history of it, because first of all, there was a lot of legislation to stop children being in the workplace. So to stop children going up chimneys. That was the 1802 Health and Morals of Apprentices Act. So no child could work in a textile factory for more than 12 hours a day. Well, that's a very long time. So night work was banned, but it was just widely not stuck to. I've just lifted out a few highlights, really. And the 1978 Factories and Workshops Act. So there was a lot of legislation that looked at limiting the access of children to the workplace. But then in 1973, this was changed and a completely different law was brought in, which enabled under 16-year-olds to take part in work experience as part of their education. And I think this has impacted the population as a whole, that people now, I don't know if any of you have been asked to find work experience for a grandchild or a neighbour. It's a very common thing, and I think this has impacted on the atmosphere within the military for partners and families. So work experience, most people have done work experience while they're at school. Another factor that I think has impacted military wives is that there's more importance placed on careers teaching in schools. Careers teaching, when I was at school, was pretty limited, really. There were discussion about being a nurse or a secretary, but there wasn't much stretching of girls. And I think this has changed completely. Nowadays, girls are encouraged to be more ambitious, to have ideas about what they want to do, and to match their work experience with whatever it is they want to do in the long run. And this is a commentator, a policy influencer called David Andrews, who's writing in 2013, and he says he wants governments to ensure that the current generation of young people in schools is no longer denied access to careers support that everybody agrees they need. And this is going to influence the population that may become military wives. There's also an issue of gender equality, which has been growing after the Second World War. Now, there may be thoughts within the audience that it isn't yet fully achieved, but there have been notable trends to make life fairer for men and women in particular. So the Butler Act of 1947, after the Second World War, led to the establishment of co-educational secondary modern schools, which were largely previously gender segregated. And by the 1960s, that's when you start getting the acknowledgement that actually girls are doing better in exams than boys. And then the Sex Discrimination Act of 1972. Again, we may discuss whether or not it's been fully implemented, but the legislation was that women could no longer be discriminated against. And all these things are going to impact on the population that may end up as military partners and wives. Then finally, I wanted to talk about how the dignity of meaningful employment is going to impact on the women. This is a lovely quote from the late Pope: "How I wish everyone had decent work. It is essential for human dignity." And this is really, I think, where the story about military partners is coming up to date, and why it's so significant in the modern military. So firstly, this is a veteran's wife, and again, this is a really recent quote. It was acquired this summer. "Many partners faced a loss of identity and self-worth, feeling stuck at home, financially stretched and increasingly isolated. I saw confidence drain from people who'd once been ambitious and capable simply because they no longer had the opportunity to work or grow professionally. Some eventually took jobs far below their skill level and experience just to get a foot out of the door." I've had numerous examples of this happening. We've been doing quite a lot of work as a charity in Cyprus this year, and it's very difficult to get a job in Cyprus. There are very few on the bases, and wives were taking jobs, really quite mundane jobs, at the local airport, supervising luggage, just in order to get out of the house, to have something to talk about, to earn themselves, and to feel that they had meaningful lives. And I think if you see this as the outcome of all the trends I've just talked about, like being taught employability in schools, being expected to have a meaningful employment once they left, I think it does make sense. Now, in terms of, so just moving on finally to talk about what could be done to facilitate partner access to employment, I think there are a number of things that could be done. This area is remarkably under-researched, actually. There's very little research done into the employability and the work experience of female partners. And this is a very interesting study that Maria Stutterford, that's her professional name, is married to somebody who was very senior in one of the services. And she went on a course, or rather her partner, her husband, went on a course. And she did a research study. It was the first time she'd ever done anything within the military, where she looked at the nature of unpaid work within military wives. So unpaid work is sort of being the doing pastoral work, doing visiting, entertaining, being diplomatic, that sort of thing. And what she said was unpaid public work had positive and negative impacts on health and well-being. Moreover, there were paradoxes typified by delaying seeking personal health care while supporting others' health and welfare needs, being on the one hand lonely, but at the same time lacking privacy or control over daily lives. and having a personal sense of value from the work alongside being valued, not being valued by formal military structures. And this was a quotation from somebody she'd interviewed, where people were leading isolated lives because they were the partners of very senior people. They were their confidants, they were trusted, they were diplomatic, but the work that they were doing was largely uncredited. I think there are also issues to do with language. I mean, every profession has its own lingo and its own acronyms, but although there have been strictures about not using terms like dependent or wife of, they still routinely get used. There are medical forms circulating where the very first question asked is name of head of household. And, you know, that feels quite archaic these days. And one may think about how this impacts on morale and motivation within forces wives and whether they want to carry on, whether these are terms that are sapping the confidence of those who are in that position, whether they actually start to feel, actually, I'm not noticed here, I'm not treated with respect, do I want to carry on? I think there's also a really dramatic need for better data on military partners. Now, at the moment, I mentioned earlier the CAMCAS survey, this continuous attitude monitoring that goes on within the forces. That's actually circulated as a questionnaire to the military partners for passing on to their spouses. So it's a questionnaire that's sent to you, and you're asked to fill it in about your attitudes to the military. So it's managed by the Ministry of Defence, but it comes through your partner. Now, as a researcher, that's really quite a problematic method of research because it isn't objective. It's coming from somebody you're married to, but who's within a structure that they are dependent on for their career. So you can question how much honesty you put into the answers that you give. If you don't complete it as a spouse, it's your partner who gets the reminder. And which I know it's ironic. There's also issues within, as I say, I'm a researcher, I know about these things, but there are all sorts of biases that can be introduced into a research process. And you really can't, there's one thing called non-responder bias. You cannot assume that people who didn't reply felt the same as people who did. There may be reasons for not replying, like you've just had a baby, you're not inclined to do it, you're cross. I mean, those are really quite, one, you're busy, one, you're deciding not to to respond, and the third, your reason for not replying is that you're cross. And those are really quite different. They're not all summed up in an assumption that those who replied feel the same way. There's also a really basic part of market research, which is that in broad terms, that you have to, as a market researcher or as a researcher, you have to leave your subjects in the same state of mind as the one in which they entered your research process. You're not meant to send them out feeling miserable. And just to read you something from the Code on Market Opinion and Social Research, the Code of Ethics says, the rights of respondents as private individuals shall be respected by market researchers, and they shall not be harmed or adversely affected as a direct result of cooperating in a market research project. Well, I think a survey that's being sent to you for passing on, sent to somebody else for passing on to you, does cause anxiety. People do worry about whether or not they can fill it in with honesty and whether that will impact their husband's or their partner's career. So I think there is a need. The argument against it is always that, of course, there would be a significant investment required, because if you're going to hold spousal data as well as the serving person data, and also hold the details of their children, so you know what entitlements they are, what they're entitled to benefit from, that's going to probably quadruple the amount of data you hold. But it would give you better figures. We still don't know in this country how many military children there are. For example, there's an estimate of 130,000. We don't know for sure. And it's very different in America, actually, that there the partner details are all noted on a database. In fact, my husband served in Afghanistan with General Petraeus. And the first time I found out about the data held by the American Army was when I got a letter from, it wasn't from General Petraeus, it was from the next level up to my husband. And the letter was commiserating with me that my husband wasn't with us on our wedding anniversary, which I was really surprised by, but that was one of the bits of data that was held on the database. So I wrote back and said, well, that's very nice of you, thank you very much. But apparently they'd never had a response before. But it did show that that actually it is possible to hold the data, and it is quite appreciated. So again, that might be something that could be fed into better communication with partners. So straightforward changes that could be made. So I think documentation and communications could be improved. Acronym, free briefings, changing the wording on key documents. I think it would be a good idea to offer guidance before a posting to both partners, not just to the one that's going. There's a big need for some standardisation over working arrangements, that when you're posted, there's a big problem at the moment with wives and partners choosing not to go on overseas postings because they don't want to give up their jobs. And research that's been done into the military has shown that a sole service, when the service person goes abroad on their own, so the wife stays or partner stays in the UK, that correlates with an early departure date, that people tend to get fed up with it and then vote with their feet. There are also opportunities for partner hubs, which could be included in while you're looking for a job. You're entitled to access to nurseries while you're abroad, but only once you've got a job. So that could be funded for the job search process. And then perhaps better integration of policies and structures. Interestingly, I got asked to give a similar talk to this to the combined staff course at Shrivenham. Now, it's a joint course, Army, Navy and Air Force all together. And I got asked to talk about it as something that generation will need to think about in future. So that seems to me a very positive thing. And then I put on your seats a leaflet about a conference that I've organised at Kingston in November, the 3rd of November, which is looking at the skill set of military partners and how it matches with recent research into the the skill set that's needed by the workforce of the future. And what I've done is recruited a whole lot of researchers from Kingston who are going to talk about research into retention and recruitment and working practices and interview practices. And I think there is a real opportunity for military wives here, or military partners here, that given that so many working practices were adjusted during the COVID period, so flexible working from home all the time, long distance working. There's a colleague at Kingston who's just recently retired, actually, but his PA is actually in New Zealand, and they've carried on working together because they knew each other's working practices really well, and the models that were developed during COVID have sustained that relationship. So if you'd like to come along or share information on that conference, you'd be very welcome. I think this is also, very interestingly, within the context of the recently published Strategic Defence Review, which I've just picked out 3 things at random. Well, not at random, for this talk. The first is that policies supporting families, including flexible working and greater stability in location and postings, should be embraced. So that's confirming what I've been talking about. And then another really important aspect of this report, which didn't mention partners very much, but is that building a societal understanding of what the armed forces do and increasing their visibility is imperative. But also, defence must play its own part in this. It shouldn't just be left to it shouldn't be left to government to make military better known. It's part of their responsibility to help the military become better known. So I just wanted to, I think we've really come full circle. This is a favourite quotation of mine. I don't know if any of you have heard this before. It's T.S. Eliot. And we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive when we started and know the place for the first time. It seems to me that's what research does. And just going back to the quote from the recruiting officer, I hope you can see that those 2 roles of the military as being respected and a glamorous thing to do and an attractive thing to do, but the difficulties of being a military partner or wife within that situation have only got worse. But I think or have been highlighted. But I think that looking to the future, the role of the military partner is really significant in shaping retention, shaping the forces of the future, and also being a force that that impacts on recruitment as well. And it couldn't be more topical given the current instability of the world and the talk about the need for forces to act on our behalf. I'd like to, if you want more information, there are 3 military families associations that exist. Then there are military charities, all of which belong to an organisation called COBSIO. If you want to look up their website, there are loads and loads of military charities that do work on behalf of military families, of which our own is one, Reading Force, which I've left some leaflets at the back. I'd like to pass on thanks to researchers whose work I've particularly drawn on, Miriam Bibby in particular, Richard Holmes, and also the archives at the National Army Museum. And just like to open up for any questions. Thank you very much indeed.